article is actually quite tongue-in-cheek, and it came about as a result of a popular ESPN host talking about, on his show last week, talking about the Cleveland Indians have a mascot, Chief Wahoo, that's considered racist or offensive by some Native American tribes, so Chief Wahoo's got to go. There's also been a lot of talk about the Washington Redskins name and whether the very wealthy owner, Dan Snyder, will change that name. So the ESPN host said, you know, leprechauns are racist. The Fighting Irish logo, I'm sure you're all familiar, he's kind of a short Irishman and he's got his dukes up. Well, that could be offensive potentially. So obviously the Wall Street Journal article was light and humorous. But the point is this, what does it say about us if we're even asking this sort of question? In other words, is the Fighting Irish leprechaun racist? Now, every trial lawyer understands that how you frame the question often determines the answer. And of course, what questions you ask or don't ask often determines the outcome itself. So the fact that we're even discussing things like this, tongue-in-cheek or not, I think tells us quite a bit about who's actually winning this debate. Many of you may be familiar with Jordan Peterson, who's become an internet sensation, a YouTube sensation in the last few months. And of course, he had a very fraught back and forth with a British TV interview recently, and I think we see in the aftermath of that interview that you know how language is being used in the West today, and that if you don't accept or just push back a little bit against certain dominant ideas, certain dominant narratives, you're in for a rough go, as Mr. Peterson found out. But of course, it's making them more popular, not less. And when it comes to pushing back against official narratives, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the story of young James Damore, who was an engineer at Google, who wrote a memo on some sort of internal listserv about that touched on various issues at Google, and minority hiring, and also women in the workplace. Whether he was right to do that at all, whether he was right to put it on the internal server, I do not know, and I'll leave to you. But it's interesting that just for expressing unpopular views, one of the site reliability engineers at Google, and this is just one of many, sent him an internal message to James Damore. You're a misogynist and terrible person. I will keep hounding you until one of us is fired. F you. And yet, of course, it was Mr. Damore who was fired for creating a hostile workplace environment, not the sender of this incendiary message. So, what I'd like to talk to you about today is language. And I want to suggest that we all ought to care a lot more about it, regardless of our personal political views. Because language is really being misused in consciously dishonest ways, as George Orwell put it. Our language is actually being seized by some very illiberal forces in society, people who are not well-intentioned. Even as they tell us they just want to create a more just and equitable world. And I think if we allow it to go on and we don't object, it's going to have some very drastic consequences.
Yes.
I wonder how many people in this room ever took a class in linguistics. I recall in my undergraduate days, I don't know if this still exists, I had a 7 a.m. class, and for whatever reason, linguistics fit it, and I took it. And I remember, I was really younger, I remember actually staying up all night and just attending the class at 7 rather than going to bed and trying to wake up and make it. So I was a good student, and I attended, and I actually loved it. Most of you are probably familiar with the name Noam Chomsky. He's probably the most famous linguist in the world. You may know him more as a left-wing social and political activist, but he was also a linguist by training. He wrote many seminal works about linguistics. And he developed what's known as the theory of universal grammar, which suggests that we're born with some sort of innate capacity for language. We have an instinct for it. And that how we learn language ultimately it shapes our brains, it shapes our views, and ultimately it actually shapes our actions. So in Chomsky's view, and I tend to agree with him, language is critically important, not only to how we learn, but how we act. It's really the foundation of understanding. And so if you control language, you control people, and you control the way they understand the world around them. So in this room, we don't have to be linguists, we don't have to be cognitive scientists or psychologists to be concerned about this. We only have to be concerned about the poverty of language we see all around us in our society, and worry about its manipulation for political and social ends that I would suggest many of us may not share. And if we think about it, if there's any group that ought to be concerned about and guarding against the misuse of language, it's lawyers, who after all make a living using words to convey very specific meanings, right? Think about contract language, think about trusts, think about statutes and statutory interpretation, think about appellate decisions and how carefully lawyers tend to parse words and grammar and all of these things. Just moving a comma around or changing a word from may instead of shall can have very real-world consequences, as we all know. And if you recall, the Supreme Court decided that the fine levied by the Obamacare Health Care Act should be treated as a tax rather than a penalty, and that allowed it in part to pass constitutional muster. So if lawyers won't police language, I guess we have to wonder who will. But it's not just lawyers, however, who ought to be concerned about this, or what I would say is an Orwellian state of our language. George Orwell, famous British author, many of you are familiar with him, wrote both Animal Farm in 1984, and the latter of those two books was thought to be a metaphor for life in the form of the Soviet Union under Stalin. So the irony here is that Orwell himself remained a staunch leftist and a socialist throughout his entire life. And he didn't consider socialism an authoritarian ideology. He considered Stalinist Russia an aberration on socialist theory. And so Orwell didn't see the USSR as truly socialist despite its name. And he actually hated Stalin. And maybe that's fair enough. I don't think many of us would consider nomenclature dispositive, right? But we wouldn't think that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is particularly democratic just because that's in its name. So words can be used quite differently by different people and have very different meanings. And this goes to a theme that we find throughout Orwell's work, namely that language can be used in consciously dishonest ways. And he wrote a great essay you can find online, it's just a page or two, called Politics in the English Language. He wrote this in about 1946, not too long before he passed away, at a very young age, a heavy smoker, and died of tuberculosis. So politics in the English language rings absolutely as true then as true today as it must have then, just coming out of World War II. So Orwell uses the term meaningless words to describe political jargon. We're all familiar with that. It's abused until it loses all value. It no longer provides descriptive value or even as an epithet. So consider Orwell writing this in 1946, again coming out of World War II. He says, the word fascism has no meaning now, except insofar as it signifies something not desirable. I think in the age of Trump, we've all heard that word bandied about a bit too loosely, to put it mildly. Here he is on the word democracy, another vague, meaningless term. In the case of a word like democracy, not only is there no agreed definition, but the attempt to make one is resisted from all sides. It is almost universally felt that when we call a country democratic, we are praising it. And again, I think we tend to find, especially our friends on the left, but also the right, to an extent, assuming that democracy around the world is the goal of U.S. foreign policy, and I'm not so sure I agree with that. So words like social justice, equity, sustainable, stakeholder, bigot, xenophobe, racist, fascist, misogynist, socialist, dreamer, snowflake, liberal, conservative, and democracy have all become our own version of today's meaningless words. Nobody knows what they mean anymore. They're used as bullets in a form of verbal warfare rather than honest descriptions. In fact, they're used quite dishonestly with the intent to deceive, which is Orwell's phrase. In other words, they're used by the speaker or the writer for their agenda rather than to create understanding or honestly define anything. And I think we ought to be better than this as a country. Now, if we think about who really controls speech today, it's interesting because it's arguably not the government. The First Amendment is one area of constitutional law where arguably, at least Judge Andrew Napolitano argues, that some of our protections have expanded a bit in terms of the case law. There's a video you can find featuring Judge Napolitano on the true meaning of the First Amendment. That's a YouTube video that I think you'd enjoy. So imagine that might be the one area of constitutional jurisprudence where freedom has not shrunk. And I think we need to be clear. Make no mistake about it, the First Amendment is really unique. It makes America very unique in the world. Even other Western countries don't have this concept of open speech. And if you couple this with pretty high bars, pretty high standards for plaintiffs trying to win defamation suits, in the United States, we really have a degree of free speech from the government end of things that's quite robust. Conceptually, free speech doesn't even exist in a lot of places in the world. It's not something that people understand intuitively, like we do as Americans. But the thing is when people can lose their career or their reputation or all their money and all their friends, even for innocent or well-intentioned violations of PC code or PC language, who needs the state to govern us and govern our language? And I'm not so sure that this free speech absolutism, which as marked the picture of the American experiment, is going to last all that much longer. If you talk to millennials, who are a huge demographic cohort, and they're bigger than the baby boomers, they're going to be entering their 40s quite soon, so coming into positions of power in places like law firms and media and business. They view free speech much more like Europeans do, as only one concern to be sort of weighed against other societal concerns, like another meaningless word, social justice. Virtually every European country, and of course Canada, have hate speech laws on the books. They're not being enforced too aggressively so far, and they're generally not being enforced in the criminal arena, only in the civil arena. It remains to be seen how long that's going to last. But polls suggest that about more than half of Democrats in the United States and a third of all Americans agree with the idea of criminalizing hate speech. And to be fair, conservatives aren't always so great on this either. Newt Gingrich has talked about calling for limits on free speech to fight terrorism. So what we have to understand is it's not just government and the First Amendment that are involved here. Now, personally, I'm a doctrinaire libertarian. I believe in virtually absolute freedom in all realms of human existence, and I would argue that even the largest mega corporation, provided it's not in a crony relationship with the government, has less power over you than a grumpy clerk at the DMV who decides not to give you your stamp that day and you're getting a parking ticket or whatever it might be. But I'm going to be honest and say that I've had to rethink that a bit in the last few years. Our relationship with corporations is voluntary, of course, and our relationship with the state is not. You have to pay your taxes, you have to abide by certain regulations, you have to do all kinds of things, or the government will come do something bad to you. But when corporations like Google or Facebook or Amazon cozy up to the federal government, then we have a problem. We find out that Google works very closely and willingly with metadata collectors like the NSA. Jeff Bezos at Amazon, now in charge of the Washington Post, by the way, is developing a huge $600 million cloud computing capacity for the CIA. And Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg was recently overheard at a UN summit telling Angela Merkel from Germany that he would get to work on suppressing Facebook comments by Germans who have the audacity to object to their government's handling of migrants. So these huge social media and tech companies are not simply neutral private sector actors, developing their own brand of political correctness that you're free to reject. They're actually cronyists, and they're partnering with the state to police not only what you consume on your social media feeds or on your regular media feeds, but also what we say. Of course, it scarcely needs to be said that academia in the United States, in particular social science departments, particular law faculties, are squarely 100% behind the political correctness movement. We could say the same of virtually all the literary arts, about Hollywood, pop music, mainstream media outlets, virtually all Fortune 500 boardrooms, at least the publicly held ones, not to mention the leaders of mainline Protestant denominations, most synagogues, and even, of course, the Bishop of Rome, Pope Francis. All of these forces in society, which are not the state per se, are nonetheless involving themselves in the language we use and the narratives we're allowed to consider acceptable for our social discourse. In other words, a lot of the policing that's taking place in the nominally private sector, it's actually us doing it to ourselves. And that's what's so scary about it. Self-censorship is really a hallmark of an authoritarian society. So if we think about it that way, we see that PC culture is winning the day without a vote, without a legislative act, without a majority, without a mandate, and really without even the judiciary, without touching or debating the First Amendment much. It's kind of happened slowly. And the rug is being pulled out from under us a bit, and I think we ought to be more cognizant of what's happening. So, if we don't define political correctness, if we just sort of throw it around as a lazy term of PC to mean something we don't like or certain forces we don't like, then we also run the risk of being lazy and violating Orwell's edict about meaningless words if we use PC just like some people use fashion. So, despite PC being an intangible thing that's difficult to necessarily put your finger on, I think it is real and I think it's definable. Here's a stab at it. Political correctness is the conscious, designed manipulation of language intended to change the way we speak, write, think, feel, and act in furtherance of an agenda. That's kind of a mouthful, but if we think about it, I think we should understand PC as propaganda. I suggest that's how we frame it. But unlike propaganda in the past, which historically was used by governments to win favor for a particular government campaign or action, PC is actually much broader than government propaganda. PC attempts to change society top to bottom, not just the state. But I think, like all propaganda, PC is fundamentally, it's about lying. It's about distorting the truth. It's about refusing to deal with the fundamental nature of reality, and in fact attempting to alter that reality through our minds and through our speech. So in a PC world, truth gives way to perceptions, and we see this so often in politics. Look at the FISA memo, brouhaha that's going on. You've got all the Democrats saying one thing, they're absolutely convinced that this was all part of a Russian attempt to help Trump get into office. And the right is saying the exact opposite. They're saying that Hillary Clinton and then lamed up President Obama were conspiring together to harm the Trump campaign. And what's going to come out of all this? We have so many media outlets. We're inundated with so many opinions and blogs, social media. I'm not sure that we're ever going to get the truth. I think what we're going to get out of the FISA memo brouhaha is just perceptions. So truth is really starting to become malleable and serve a purpose that's determined by our would-be superiors. And I think more than anything, PC, it means pursuing an agenda that none of us asked for, or I suspect few of us asked for. Now, if we step back just a little bit, we tend to think that PC is something brand new, that it just sort of came up from spontaneous combustion in the 1990s or something. That's not actually true. And I think some form of PC has always existed. I'm sure we can safely assume that historically that feudal chiefs and kings and emperors and politicians have really always and ever attempted to control language and the thoughts and the actions of their subjects. I don't think that's new. The thought police have always existed. But now they have this digital apparatus, the means to scale, as they say in the tech world. And of course, in the more recent 20th century, we can look at avatars like Karl Marx, who believed in developing a perfect man, someone who was more valuable for the state. We can look at the Frankfurt School, which Jordan Peterson talks about, to understand this idea, very popular in social science departments. We have to deconstruct the 20th century, and part of that includes deconstructing language. Some of you might have heard of Leo Strauss, who was a famous neoconservative guru, and he had a huge impact on the war-hungry think tank world, talking about democracy and the need for the United States to have a robust presence around the world. I'm sure many of you have heard of Saul Alinsky, the radical left-wing operative, and of course the French philosopher Foucault was actually the first person to use the term political correctness in the 1960s. So there's all these kind of strange origins where PC came from that we can trace back to understand a little bit better what's going on today. But if you really want to understand PC, I cannot suggest a better name than the godfather of modern spin, a man named Edward Bernays. Not a household name, but his impact on all of us, especially in terms of the advertising we consume, is absolutely unbelievable. This is a remarkable man He literally wrote the book on propaganda and its softer guise of public relations, PR. He's not that well known in the West today, but he actually was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, interestingly. He was born in Austria in the late 19th century, came to the United States as an infant in New York City, and then he proceeded to live an astonishing 103 years until he died in 1995. So one of his first jobs was working as a press agent for Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information, which was really the first overt propaganda agency in the United States. And the whole purpose of this agency at the time was to gin up popular support for U.S. entry into World War I. And if you look a bit at history, you'll find that especially German and Irish Americans were opposed very strongly to the United States getting into what they considered Europe's war. So it was Edward Bernays who coined the phrase, "make the world safe for democracy." Now, who could be against that, right? You can feel the power of that, and you can understand how sloganeering was a powerful way to turn public perception. Who wants to be the German American or the Irish American who doesn't want to make the world safe for democracy? Make the world keep the world unsafe would be the presumed opposite. So after the war, he decided to apply some of these same techniques to the more peaceful business of selling stuff. So he went into the advertising world and had some very, very successful campaigns for things that are long gone now, like Ivory soap. Some campaigns our grandparents probably saw in the newspaper. Perhaps his greatest accomplishment, if you want to call it that, was making it acceptable for American women to smoke. Not that long ago, less than 100 years ago, this was seen as a dirty, masculine habit, I guess perhaps like chewing tobacco. And at certain times in American history, a habit for which women could be arrested if they were found doing it. But in the flapper era, the 1920s, a lot of the old pre-war modes of social interaction were breaking down, and so at the behest of Lucky Strike cigarettes, which I think still exist, Bernays arranged for a group of very glamorous women to join the 1929 Easter parade in New York City and march smoking what they called torches of freedom instead of cigarettes. Well, you can imagine what happened after that. The stigma quickly evaporated, and Lucky Strike, just like that, doubled its potential customers by bringing in women. The irony in this is that later in life, his own wife, Bernays' own wife, would die of lung cancer, and he would express regret over his role in glamorizing this. The point here is just to suggest a name to you that you might not be familiar with. He's a fascinating guy. All of his books are very short. They're called things like Manufacturing Consent. He has one called Propaganda. And he really is the godfather of a lot of what's happening now, even if it's almost subconscious on our part. He really took this concept of herd psychology to heart. The herd entails just what we think. It's a deep-seated psychological need to win the approval of one social group. We'll see how this might operate with cigarettes. The herd overwhelms any other influences on us as social humans, at least in his view. Our need to fit in and go along is paramount. And I think that's such an important force at work today in our language and in PC culture. But he went a step further, and in Bernays' view, that the herd instinct can't be trusted. In other words, the herd is irrational, it's dangerous, it doesn't always know what's best for it. It needs to be steered by wiser men in 1,000 imperceptible ways. And the key is that they must not know that they're being steered. I think most of us in this room like to think that we think for ourselves, but we may do it less than we imagine. So public relations in his time was something much broader and deeper than what we think of as just PR today. He didn't see himself as an advertising man. He saw himself as a transcendent creator who shaped events and perceptions at all levels of society. And judging by his impact, he wasn't megalomaniacal. He actually was just powerful. Now here's his daughter Anne talking about him. She said, in his view, the public's democratic judgment is not to be relied upon. That sounds a little bit like Trump, and what people said when Trump won. They could easily vote for the wrong man or want the wrong thing, so they had to be guided from above. This guidance was a sort of enlightened despotism. That's his own daughter saying that. So, but I think that's exactly how a lot of intellectuals in today's world, in academia and politics and media, think today. And I think that the techniques that Bernays employed are still very much being used. So first, he understood how all-powerful the herd mind is. We all think of ourselves as special snowflakes, but in fact, it turns out we might be rather timorous creatures who are easily led, and we want to fit in and gain acceptance of the group more than we think. And there's a very stubborn human tendency to seek out a tribe, whether that's familial or social or religious or ethnic or political. And second, he understood that the critical importance of using third-party authorities to sell cost of their products. You notice a lot of Hollywood celebrities are very much on the anti-Trump bandwagon, they're very much on the DC bandwagon. So celebrities, athletes, models, politicians, wealthy elites, they're the people from whom the herd takes its cues. So whether they're endorsing some sort of left-wing political cause, whether they're selling you a luxury car or a watch, you're more likely to listen to George Clooney than you are someone who's not George Clooney, apparently. And what Bernays really understood finally was the role that emotions play in all this, in our taste and in our preference. It's not really a particular brand of cigarette or a particular handbag or watch that we own. It's the lifestyle that's represented by the ad itself that really touches us. So when you think about a Tesla or a Jaguar or something like that, you're kind of buying or trying to buy almost a lifestyle. And that's why the Tesla isn't stuck in traffic in the ad, right? It's going down a beautiful road by the Pacific Ocean or something like that. So he's really a fascinating man, and I suggest if you have a little spare time for reading by your bedside to check out Edward Bernays. You won't be disappointed. I think you'll come away with a much better understanding of how PC causes, even though many of them are actually deeply unpopular in terms of just majorities, weave themselves into the fabric of our culture and ultimately win the day. Now, there's one element of political correctness that I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention, and we've all heard this argument. That's the argument from niceness, right? PC isn't authoritarian. It isn't an attempt to control it. It's just about being nice, and certain things have changed in society and culture versus 100 years ago, and we ought to incorporate that in our language. Okay, well that sounds fair, and that sounds reasonable enough. But we're told that, well, this is all about simple respect and inclusiveness. But I'm not so sure we need the PC enforcers to make us understand what really boils down to human decency and kindness. I don't think anyone in this room needs any prodding to not call a person retarded if they have some mental disabilities. I think that can evolve just fine on its own. The use of the N-word evolved out of society on its own. I don't think any of us would endorse abusive language or making fun of someone's appearance or someone's disabilities or to tolerate bullies. And I don't think that's what PC is actually all about, because if PC was really just about kindness and respect, I don't think we'd have anything to worry about in this country. If you travel the world, you'll find that Americans are viewed as nothing if not nice and cordial and welcoming in other places. And we already have a term, don't we, for the kind of social cohesion that PC is said to represent. It's called manners. And we already have specific individuals who are charged with ensuring that good manners are inculcated and prevail. These agents are called parents. I mean, does anybody really believe that our PC culture is nicer today than that of our decidedly not PC grandparents' time? If you do, I suggest you spend a little time on social media. Of course not. PC isn't nice, and neither are its enforcers. This is designed to degrade and reshape Western culture into something that's purposely ugly, something that insults the eye, the ear, the mind. You know, for all of our talk about being yourself, and for all of our lack of personal restraint, you know, the emphasis on individual feelings that underscores so much of political correctness is actually very conformist when we think about it. It's actually very sterile. The PC at the end of the day is not about being nice, it's not about not calling people names, it's about controlling words. And from that, controlling thoughts and ultimately actions. So it's kind of almost a form of reverse engineering. And I'll leave you with this. We have to understand that the PC enforcers, they're not asking you, they're not debating you. They don't care about your vote. They plan to win this and to prevail by any means necessary, legal or extra-legal or judicial. There are millions of people in the United States who would absolutely criminalize today, would advocate putting people in jail and criminalizing speech that just doesn't comport with their particular sense of social justice. And I would argue that that, in and of itself, is un-American. So in conclusion, if we think about PC as a virus that puts us, liberty-loving people, on our heels, it allows progressives to frame the debate and control the narrative, just like you might want to in a courtroom. We lose a lot of power over our lives. And this isn't so much about us as it is about our kids and grandkids. I mean, that's where we really have to work. Because if we don't address what the state and its, at least nominally, private sector agents are doing to control us, I'm afraid we might honestly wonder how much longer the American form of free speech will survive. And it's coming soon to a server near you unless we all get busy. And I'll leave you with this. The resistance starts with all of us, including those of us in this room, withdrawing our own consent, participation in what I think is a very damaging and un-American trend. So thank you very much.
So let's just, you want to just take some questions and we'll just open it up to the audience.
Well, if I can, let me just take a couple quick moments to talk about the Mises Institute. The Mises Institute, for lack of a more descriptive term, is an economics-based think tank. What we call Austrian economics is actually a very broad umbrella, and it was basically the dominant school of thought until John Maynard Keynes came along in 1935 and changed, it wrote his general theory, which really changed the face of economics. And what our institute does is it tries to promote writers and scholars and thinkers who have a different view, in particular, that economics is a social science. It's not a physical science like physics or chemistry. And so human beings and human actors aren't molecules or particles, they're not atoms. They don't bounce around in ways that we can necessarily test and create hypotheses for like we do in physical sciences. So we try to look at science as something that involves human action. So it's more akin to behavior and psychology than it is math and predictive models. And if you notice, the mainstream economics field has not been too good in its predictions in the last 50 or 20 years. And more than that, we try to be sort of an alternative school where people can come without spending 4 years in college and thousands of dollars to learn just what they want to learn about economics without all the extraneous stuff. So we're growing. We were part of Auburn University for many, many years, and then ultimately decided to become independent with our own budget and our own building right across the street. If any of you ever find yourselves in Auburn, please feel free to stop by and say hello. We'd love to see you and show you one of the largest private libraries in the entire Southwest. And if you're interested in free markets, if you're interested in libertarian thought, you go to Mises.org, MISES.org, and you'll find more reading than you could handle in the rest of your lifetime. So,